Good evening, everyone. So glad to see you here. I'm glad that you didn't allow the snow to keep you back from being with us this evening. That was supposed to be a joke, folks. Didn't you see the snow this morning? Yes. Anyway, thank you so much for being here to our final presentation of this conference. And I trust that you will continue to enjoy it as we have been throughout this week. Shall we bow our heads for prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to hear this message tonight. Please give us the ears that we need to hear and the hearts to be receptive to what we need to be receptive to so that we can grow and experience more. In your name we pray. Amen.
Hello, my name is Alexis Martinez, and I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Mario Jimenez Sifuentez. Dr. Sifuentez is currently an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Merced. He grew up in Ontario, Oregon, earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in 2002 from the University of Oregon, and then received his master's in history and ethnic studies 2 years later from the same institution. Dr. Sifuentez then went on to earn his second master's, this time in American Civilization, from Brown University in 2005. He continued on at Brown, and in 2010 earned his PhD in American Studies with a focus on immigration and labor. In 2014, he co-authored the Smithsonian exhibit, The Bracero Program, Bittersweet Harvest. Tonight, Dr. Sifuentez's presentation will highlight his book of Forests and Fields, Mexican Labor in the Pacific Northwest, published in 2016. The work tracks the history of Mexican and Mexican-American labor, beginning with the World War II era Bracero program, and following the labor force's efforts to achieve fair wages, favorable living conditions, and overall human dignity through the agency asserted through various labor unions in the decades that followed. While Dr. Sifuentez's work draws on union records, employment contracts, and labor legislation, it is perhaps best characterized by its use of oral history. The inclusion of the Hispanic workers' voices as a personal element to the Mexicanization of the region that is otherwise somewhat hard to come by. Of Forests and Fields is very much a tribute, a celebration of the laborers' perseverance and accomplishments through various legal conflicts and personal difficulties. The work highlights Mexican and Mexican-American identities as integral to the structure of the Pacific Northwest, and it emphasizes their place in the U.S. beyond being the source of the produce that finds itself in households nationwide. And on a personal note, Dr. Sifuentez's book was the very first work of history that I ever encountered, in which I could see my own family's history reflected and honored. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mario Jimenez Sifuentez.
Thank you so much. I mean, I just got chills hearing you say that because so much of what I wanted it to do was that work exactly, right? It reminds me of my story in the sense that when I was a kid, I'd always asked the question of myself, right? Like how did we end up in Oregon? How did we end up in this small rural town in the middle of nowhere? And I never had a clear answer. Could never find a clear answer. And part of me sort of believed that when I got to college, I would find that answer. And I sought and I sought and I sought, and I never found that book, right? And I remember having a conversation with my professor, Matt Garcia, who I followed to Brown when he was at the University of Oregon. I followed him to Brown, and he said, well, you're always talking about that, you can't find this book and you can't find this book, and every book I read was about Caesar or, the UFW in Texas or in California, and nothing about Oregon, nothing about Washington, Idaho, all the places that we had grown up working, nothing was there. And he said to me, well, he's like, if nobody's written this book, why don't you write it? And that was the moment where like a meme, like my head exploded, right? I was like, what? Wait, what? And he's like, yeah, why don't you write it? You're from here, you grew up here, you know the people, you know the story. You should write this book. And that was the first time that it had dawned on me that these things that we read, these things that we take for granted or take at the face value or, sort of consume sometimes uncritically are actually pieced together by human beings, right? Like people do these things. And it becomes incredibly important that people who come from places like we come from, that I come from, that Alexis comes from, gets to write those books, right? Because it's a different book, it's a different story. So that's sort of where, this whole thing begins, right? Like, I encourage all of you, right, as you're thinking about this, to think about your family as an archive, right? When I started to do this work, when I started to say, okay, I'm going to write this book, about Mexicans in the Pacific Northwest, it was difficult, right, to find the sources, to find the things in the traditional archives. I would find these Bureau of Labor reports, or I would find census, or I would find farm reports, or I'd find these things that would say 500 Mexicans were working in this place at this time, at this wage. They picked so many acres, so many pounds of this and so many bushels of that. And it was one of those things where I was like, this is not a story that I want to tell, right? This is not a story that I want to tell about this bureaucratic perception of who we were, where we lived, what kind of conditions we lived in, what kind of work we did. I was like, those kinds of stories are empty of any kind of humanity, of any kind of reality, right? And so I started thinking about where are these archives? And they're in our parents' basements, in a suitcase, right? They're in a closet. They're in those places. And every family, I promise you, every family has an unofficial historian, everyone. They may not even know that they're the unofficial historian, but they're the unofficial historian. They have the documents, they have the papers, they have the stories that are oftentimes too painful to tell, but they're there, right? And we have to start to excavate those stories. And so what I always start my presentations with is these documents that were held, right, in an archive in my family. And so this one is my grandfather's application for citizenship, right? He was, like many of this generation, and like I talk about in the book, was a bracero, were the first sort of long-term or consistent immigrants to the Pacific Northwest. There's some historians that argue that there were small Mexican communities in the Pacific Northwest, and there were maybe towns of 100 people, or towns with 100 Mexicans in it, or some who had roots dating back to Spanish explorers, etc. But those were sort of incidental in many ways, right? And it's the Bracero program that really starts to bring people to the Northwest over and over and over and over again, right, for the 20 some odd years of the program. And my grandfather was one of those. And so this is a letter from a farmer in Ontario by the name of Taro Yoshihara, who employed my grandfather and who wrote a letter speaking to his character and what he was working and how he was working in an effort to try to bring his wife, my grandmother, right, and her children over from Mexico to be with him in Ontario. And so looking at this document, obviously the first thing that stood out to me was the fact that my grandfather worked for a Japanese farmer, right? And so right away I say, okay, there's a story there, right? There's something there. And so if any of you have read the book, there's a significant story there of Japanese folk growers in the Pacific Northwest and in Ontario in particular. And so these are the naturalization papers. That's my grandmother in the right-hand corner. I was trying to see if there's my Piedras Negras, Coahuila, Mexico, where my family was from. Are you from Piedras? Yeah, so that's where my family was from too. They're from El Moral. Well, my parents were born in El Moral, outside of Piedras. And so again, this is a history of this community, right? And we know where I grew up, there was an entire neighborhood of people from Piedras, and people from Eagle Pass, from La Aguila. This is my father and my aunt, my oldest aunt, working in the fields. And again, these are photos that I had never seen before, right? And things that I had never thought of as a historical document. And I started looking at these photos and sort of thinking about the kind of work that they did, right? And where they were. So one of these is the cover of my book, the one on the right, which is a picture of my cousin Javier, Javi Garcia, who's in the audience over there. Lives in Hermiston now. So I had the running joke for a while because the one on the left is his older brother, Jesse, and I never told him which one of them was on the cover of the book. And whenever one of them was in the room, I'd say it's that one, right? But the one on the left is actually Jesse, and the one on the right is Javi. But again, these are photos of us working in the fields, of living there, of struggling, and as I was flying in, I was like, I've been to Walla Walla before, but it didn't look like this, right? It was onions. And all I remember is onion fields. And I was like, I don't see any onion fields as I'm flying over. But in Ontario, and sugar beets, potatoes, onions, that's the work that we did. And again, it becomes one of those things why is this important, right? And how is it a thing that matters? And I can tell you that these are the stories that I wanted to tell, where I haven't seen my cousin in a few years, and we were talking over dinner today about, we would be out in the middle of these fields, in the middle of nowhere, where the only radio station we could get was a country music radio station, and how we grew up listening to Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash, and being like, what Mexicans listen to Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash? And here we are, know all this country music, and these stories of are stories of exploitation, and they're stories of oppression, and they're stories, but they are also stories of fun, right? We talked when we were having dinner today, we said some of the best times we've ever had were out there, right? And how do you tell that story? How do you tell a story of joy, of perseverance, of humanity, without negating the very real reality of exploitation, of labor exploitation, of oppression, without simultaneously, right, sort of dehumanizing the subject? And so that's what I was sort of seeking to do. And there was nothing in the official archive that would allow me to do that, right? And so for the first kind of couple years in grad school, I was kind of banging my head against the wall trying to figure out how I was going to tell this story and how I was going to tell this story. And then this happened, right? The Smithsonian had found a treasure trove of photos of braceros by a photographer named Nadal, right? And we're sort of trying to figure out what they were going to do with them. And so they came to my mentor, who had written a book about Mexican farm workers in California, and said, hey, we have these photos, we want to do an exhibit, how should we do this? And we started looking at the photos, and almost all the photos were given this nondescript kind of line, right? It's Mexican male, 25 sugar beets, or Mexican male, 35, alfalfa, or whatever. And it was just constantly anonymous Mexican male, anonymous Mexican male. And it started to really bother us that we were being asked to put together an exhibit for the Smithsonian that continued to do that kind of violence to these individuals, right? This nameless, anonymous, who when you look at the photos, especially me and my mentor, both Mexican, both looking, seeing the faces of our grandfathers in all of these photos, and then just being anonymous Mexican male. And so we got to do something different. Like we shouldn't do this. And so we started sort of kicking around ideas, and there's a institute called the George Mason University Institute for New Media. The UTEP, we looked at a bunch of oral history projects, including UTEP, the University of Texas El Paso has a great oral history project. And so we started reaching out to people and say, well, how do we find these people, right? That becomes the key. The key now becomes, let's find these folks, and let's get them to tell their own stories about where they were, where they worked, how they lived, and all these things, right? And so we ended up getting a huge grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, $3 million. We hired a bunch of undergrads, there was me and a couple of other graduate students, and we started to kind of plot this whole thing out, right? And so what we decided is that the Bracero program had these processing centers, right, across the border. So like in Empalme, in Sonora, and there's various different places, El Centro in California, and where the braceros would be brought. They would go through these, I'll talk about that process here in a second. But we started to find where those places were and where these bracero camps used to be. And we started traveling during the summers of our school years to places like El Centro and El Valle Imperial in California, and Chicago, large Mexican population in Chicago. And we started going to these different places. And we would arrive on a Monday, and we would say, we'd go to local news stations, Spanish language radio stations, we'd go on TV, we'd go to churches and say, hey, we're gonna be at this salon on a Friday. We want to give you a presentation and show you what we're doing, what we're trying to do here, right? We want to tell the story. If you were a bracero, please come, come to this presentation. So we did this bilingual presentation where we talked about sort of, what we were trying to do, who we were trying to talk to, who we were as representatives of the Smithsonian. And we would get pretty large crowds, right? I mean, we would get 100, 150 people, but it was mostly not braceros. It was mostly their family members that were coming. And so we were sort of trying to convince the family members, the children mostly, or the grandchildren of braceros, like, hey, this is what we're doing, you should get them to come. And the first one that we did was in the Coachella Valley. And I remember we were at dinner that night after we did the presentation, and we were sitting there at dinner, and we looked at each other, and we had the realization, right? And we said, oh, what if nobody comes, right? We had this $3 million grant. We're promising all this stuff to the Smithsonian, and we're like, what if nobody shows up? And we panicked. We completely panicked. And none of us could sleep that night. And we got up 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. We went to the place, like usually it was usually some salon at a church or VFW or some, Legion building or something like that. And we got up that first day at 5 o'clock in the morning, got our stuff together, went down to the salon, and there was a line, right? And if any of you have ever tried to beat an old Mexican man out of bed, it's impossible, right? They're gonna beat you out of bed every time. And so we get there and there's a line, probably 100 people deep. And it had the feeling of a family reunion. The people who hadn't seen each other in 10, 20, 30 years, 40 years, hugging and telling stories and crying, and it's like these 80, 70, 80-year-old Mexican men who hadn't seen each other in decades. And then the panic switched from what if nobody shows up to how are we going to interview all these people in the day, right? And so then it became this thing where literally at that moment, when I saw those people show up, I turned around, I told the undergrads and I told the grad student, I said, hey, if anybody, we had them fill out these intake forms, I should say first, and they would say, okay, what years did you work? Where did you work? How long, where were you from? Where were you born? These little intake forms so we could kind of start doing the metadata for the project that we were doing. And literally that morning I said, hey, if anybody says they worked in Oregon, Idaho, or Washington, I want to interview them. And it was cool. So they just funneled all those folks to me. And that was the beginning of the book, right? That's that moment where I was like, it just dawned on me. I was like, this is how we're going to do it. It's going to be oral history, right? Because I had done some oral history research. I had done some writing, some reading on it, but I had not thought about it as the primary kind of vehicle for the story that I wanted to tell, right? And so then at that moment, I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be an oral history. The book is going to be an oral history. And so then at that moment, it became, okay, send them to me, send them to me, send them to me. And everything that I had thought, right, about them enjoying their lives to one way or the other was true, right? So again, if you've read the book, you know that this is the processing centers where all the braceros would come. So let me go through these real quick. But this is the processing center, which was, again, sort of a completely dehumanizing experience. They would do these physical constitution checks, so you can see, I'm not sure if I have a laser pointer on here, but you could see the Anglo farmer there on the right would literally go through, and they would just, and again, these photos in of themselves, when you look at these photos, you might not necessarily see the violence being done, but when you interviewed the braceros, they would tell us, oh yeah, no, these guys would come and like grab our butts and like shake our bodies and and try to feel our muscles and like groping them to see if they were laborers, right? And if you were not stout or if you're not physical, right, they would say, no, you're, because at the time there were a lot of people, who were trying to come to the United States regardless if they were laborers or not. They would do these chest x-rays and these TB scans, tuberculosis scans, et cetera, with the assumption, of course, that Mexicans were diseased. And this was a hand check. And so you would present your hands to the grower again, and if you had calluses on your hand, then you passed. If you didn't, not going to get contracted again, because if you couldn't show signs of wear, then you weren't a good worker. And so you were tossed aside. And then finally, again, with this sort of assumption that Mexicans were diseased, there were routine sprayings of DDT, right? Which, of course, as we know, is a carcinogen now, right? And so, there was this kind of like violence that's being done where you can see that the people who are doing the spraying are wearing masks because they understand what they're doing, right? They understand the kind of violence that they're inflicting, but not providing that same kind of protection for the braceros. And so as I'm doing these oral histories, I'm getting these stories that are fantastic, these stories of camaraderie, these stories of friendship, these stories, a lot of which, sort of make it into the book, but you also get these stories of the bracero program that people had not really talked about, right? The reforestation work, and in particular the railroads, right? And so in the Pacific Northwest, a number of the braceros were working on railroads. And I remember interviewing one individual who would tell me, we used to have these parties, we had this big party for Mexican Independence Day, and we pulled down the Mexican flag and we pulled down the American flag and we raised up the Mexican flag. And those of you who do oral history or thinking about doing oral history, is like, always believe people what they say. Always, right? Verify, but believe, right? And so he's telling me this story and I'm like, no way. I mean, there's no way that some grower in Oregon, in Southern Oregon, is gonna let you pull down the American flag and raise the Mexican flag. That's not gonna happen. And so I was like, okay, well, where was this? Okay, Medford, outside Medford, all right, cool. So then when I go back to Oregon to do archival research, I actually find the photo that he's talking about, right, of the Mexican flag being raised. You can see it over there on the right, the Mexican flag being raised in the labor camp. And I was like, that's amazing. It's amazing, right? Like, they had at least that level of autonomy, right, that they could have celebrations, that they could raise a sign of their nationalism, right, in a place that I'm sure was not conducive to that kind of celebration. And so, again, a lot of the stuff makes it in the book, dances, going skinny dipping, doing all these things that you would not, playing guitars and buying radios and things that tell a story of joy, right, of in the face of it all, right? And so, what that does for me, right, in terms of the book is to say, okay, those first couple of chapters, right, about the first chapter about the Rossetto program kind of leads the charge for the rest of the book and making oral history the central point of all of these stories. And so I go home, I talk to my parents, and I say, okay, hey, I want to do an oral history with you. I want to talk to you about where we were, where you worked, where, our lives in the field. And they were not interested at all. I was like, no, it's okay. And so I was like, okay, well, who should I talk to then? And then they was like, well, you need to talk to Osvaldo. And Osvaldo was our enganchador, right? He was our contractor. And so those of you who are familiar, might be familiar, is the contractor goes to Mexico, finds people, brings them up to work for various farmers. And so, and again, those of you who are thinking about doing this kind of work, there's always that one person in the community, right? And so Osvaldo Gonzalez was his name. He was a Mexican-American, but grew up in Texas, grew up on the border, and was the enganchador for like so many families out there, so many. And so I interviewed him, and while his interview wasn't like groundbreaking necessarily, he was like, well, now you need to go talk to this person, you need to go talk to that person, and you need to go talk to that person. And that's when it all like started to just come, right? All of this just started. I started to just come to talk to everybody, and that's where I got the story of the Japanese growers. And the story of the Japanese growers, I think, is a really important thing for you to understand, especially those of you who are undergrads or thinking about going to graduate school and doing historical work. Is growing up in that town, I hated the Japanese kids. I hated them. They were the meanest kids. They never hesitated to remind you that your parents worked for them. They never hesitated to call you names, to say things to try to put you in your place. It never failed, never failed. And so when I started to do the research, I expected, right, to find a story of Japanese growers exploiting Mexican laborers. And the more interviews that I did, the less true that became. Right? And the more the stories were like, well, the Japanese were the only ones that would rent to us, right? And the Japanese were the only ones that would let us use the Japanese hall for quinceañeras, right? The Japanese had a baseball field and they let us use it. The Japanese rented homes to us. And then finally, right, the Japanese gave us year-round work. And that's where you see my grandfather's letter, where my grandfather had been working for 4 years for this one grower. Right? And there was a clue in that letter, but the whole picture didn't come together until I started talking to the people who had been working in the fields for 30 or 40 years, right? So the Japanese in Ontario and Eastern Oregon had a unique history, right? There was the largest free Japanese population during the war. They ran a niche economy at the time, which was the onions and packing sheds. The packing sheds were not something that Anglos got involved with, and so the Japanese began to sort of dominate the packing sheds and started providing year-round employment for Mexican immigrants, and that's why there are any Mexicans at all in Eastern Oregon, right? That's why we ended up staying, and that's why you end up creating a community there, right? And what I call the Mexicanization, right? Because they brought the music, the culture, the dances, all of those things start to really become a permanent fabric, right, of Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington and these other places, right? And so, so that's just sort of a cautionary tale, right, is that you always have to go where the evidence takes you, no matter what your personal experience might be, no matter what your personal history might be. You go where the evidence takes you. And it took me to this fantastic story, right, of the Japanese growers in the Pacific Northwest, or in Eastern Oregon in particular. And so that becomes, the second chapter of the book, and a chapter that I get to talk about my hometown, right? And I get to talk about where I grew up and how it changed and how it evolved, and the kind of resistance that existed in those spaces. And still the kind of joy, right? Quinceañeras, weddings, a lot of baseball, right? Like all of those things become really pertinent to creating this Mexican community. in the Pacific Northwest. And I purposely used the term Mexican and not Mexican immigrant or Mexican American because of the very mixed status, right, of all the different people who were there. Some of them are documented, some of them are undocumented, some of them are third generation, some of them are first generation. And I really felt like Mexicanization spoke to the kind of culture that was being produced as opposed to like an immigration status, right, that was dominating the area. So that opens up a whole, world of possibilities for me, because, initially without the oral histories, I wasn't sure how I wanted to tell that story. And so then finally, when I was an undergrad, I was very involved in activist politics and working for, at the time, as an undergrad, I was working for PECUN, which is the Farm Workers Union in Woodburn, Oregon. And so that connection, that connection to PECUN and other activists is what eventually opened the door for me to be able to look at PECUN's archives, right? And so I didn't know that PECUN had archives, right? I didn't know how I was going to tell that story, and I was lucky in that, I must have been at that point 6 or 7, no, probably more than that, like 8 or 9 years removed from undergrad, from activist work as an undergrad, but yet they remembered the work that we did, right, as the MECHA at University of Oregon. And so it opened a door for me that got me into the archives that then started to lead to the oral histories again. Unfortunately, one of the co-founders, Cipriano Ferrer, had passed away in the early 2000s. But I was able to look at a lot of his documents and a lot of his papers. And the important part of this story, I think, is that, Cipriano grew up in Delano. He worked for the UFW. He was a bodyguard for Caesar for a number of years. And was a member of the Brown Berets, right, and along with Ramon Ramirez, who was also a member of the Brown Berets. And so I think what it tried to show right through the story is this kind of history of activism and the connections that it has to these organizations that might be defunct in many ways now, but that have these long-lasting impacts on the struggle, right? And that struggle is changing over time, and maybe it's urban or rural or unionization or immigration rights or whatever it might be, but that it changes and grows over time, and that people often look at an organization like the Brown Berets and talk about success or failure. And I think it's very important to understand the success of organizations not as whether or not that organization itself succeeded in terms of its goals, although I think that's important. It's whether or not, what kind of impact those members had once that organization was defunct, right? And so you can see that with the UFW, for instance, where like some of the best organizers in the UFW, like Marshall Gans or Eliseo Medina, go on to work at SEIU and work on the Justice for Janitors campaign or whatever else it might be. And so the Brown Berets become a really important story in the history of farm worker organizing in the Pacific Northwest, even though it's primarily an urban organization. Another really important organization, or I should say, I guess not an organization, it's a university, another important sort of focal point of labor organizing in the Pacific Northwest is at Colegio Cesar Chavez, which was a four-year university, the first Hispanic serving institution in the country, right? And it was designated as a HSI in 1977. And its graduating class at the time produced more BAs and of Mexican descent than Oregon State, Oregon, and the University of Washington combined, right? And so it was a place where like Chicanos flocked to for their education. They had a motto called "College Without Walls," and so they had a traditional curriculum, but they also gave credit for working as a mechanic or working as a paralegal or working as various other kinds of jobs they would give academic credit for. It was in Mount Angel, Oregon. It had taken over a defunct Catholic school in Mount Angel, Oregon, but it never could really sort of manage its financial difficulties, and eventually closes in 1983. It's a lot more complicated than that, but again, that's just to say that although the university itself, although the college itself no longer exists, it has this sort of massive effect on the politics in Oregon, right? Because primarily we had the meeting of Cipriano Ferrer, who had come from Delano, enrolled at the University of Oregon, decided that the University of Oregon was not for him, went up to the Colegio Cesar Chavez and started to attend school there. Ramon Ramirez, again, who's the current president of PECUN. Actually, he's retired now. We have a new president. Reina Lopez is the new president. But Ramon Ramirez was a student at University of Washington. Same thing, was like, this is not for me. He had come from East LA and left and had heard about Colegio Cesar Chavez, left UW, enrolled at the Colegio Cesar Chavez, along with another co-founder of PECUN, Juan Mesa, and this Russian Jewish guy by the name of Larry Kleinman, who was enrolled at Oberlin College, who then also decided he had heard about what's going on out in the Pacific Northwest and decided that he needed to go be a part of that and went out there. And so they all meet and they start talking about sort of immigrant rights. You know, one of the things that they had consistently seen in Oregon was these consistent immigration raids that were happening sort of over and over and over again that were, you know, sort of striking fear in the hearts of the community, where like a typical Sunday in Woodburn, Oregon, was sort of filled with Mexicans going to the theater or going shopping or whatever, and after one of these raids, it would just be a ghost town. And so they started thinking about sort of what they were going to do, and again, Ramon Ramirez and Cipriano Ferrer had experience with the UFW, and UFW had some interest in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. But if you look at Caesar's papers, he was, he called Oregon and Washington a distraction, right? If you look at his diary, he's like, this is a distraction. We had the real fight is here in Delano, and all the resources that we're spending over there, it's no good, man. It's not good for us. And so there was always this kind of half-hearted attempt to organize farm workers in the Pacific Northwest by the UFW, right? And on top of that, it became a really big concern. Like I said, Cipriano had left that UFW, and there was never really this clear-cut or public discussion of why he had left. And so the more I dug into what they were doing, the more it became clear that they were really interested, the PECUN people were really interested in thinking about organizing undocumented people, right? Because that was the majority of the people that were in Oregon at the time. Let me see what this one. And so this is something that, again, like, you have to go where the evidence takes you, right? The UFW, I think, for many, many years, and definitely through my college years, held a place of very high esteem, and a place that was in many ways sacrosanct, right? You couldn't say anything negative about the UFW, but the reality of it was that the UFW was actively campaigning against undocumented people, right? Actively. And what comes out with doing the oral histories with Ramon and then looking at Cipriano's papers, that was one of the big reasons that they had left California in the first place, right? Didn't want to work with the UFW. The UFW felt, to Ramon, who was in East LA, sort of outdated and sort of stuck in its ways about undocumented immigrants. And then Cipriano had seen firsthand, right, the sort of attack on undocumented immigrants. Now, a lot of people, want to say that, like, well, maybe they were against scabs, but they weren't really against immigrants, and maybe they were a hurdle to unionization efforts and all of these other things, and those things were true. But the more I dug into the United Farm Workers papers, the more it became clear that this was not an incidental political position but one that was actively pursued and actively engaged in. And so this is an example. This is a report out of the Fresno office, and there's reams of these reports. UFW workers would call the INS and inform the INS of where undocumented immigrants lived, where they were working, how many of them there were, and it did not matter if the UFW was engaged in an active unionization campaign. It did not matter. They called in on construction places. They called it on apartment housing. And again, there's reams and reams of these. And here's an actual log, right, in which they say, okay, we called the Border Patrol at this number, at this time. We spoke to this person. Right? And so the United Farm Workers are dedicating time and energy to trying to get the Border Patrol to round up undocumented immigrants. And so again, like, you have to go where the evidence takes you, right? The evidence speaks to this anti-immigrant positionality of the UFW that helps explain why Picun becomes who they are, right? Because Picun takes a completely different approach, right? And they borrow from CASA, which was a Centro de Acción Social Autónoma that was based out of Los Angeles. That was sort of a Marxist organization that had the motto, right, con o sin papeles, trabajadores crean riqueza, right? And so, like, with or without papers, workers create richness, create wealth, right? And so this is, again, CASA ceases to really function as an organization during the Palmer raids in the 1950s, right? As a sort of Marxist communist organization, they're taken out by the Palmer raids, by the FBI, and yet their message starts to ring through time, right, into the 1970s to these organizers in Woodburn, Oregon. I guess initially they started in Portland, but they moved to Woodburn. And so they begin, Larry, Ramon, Cipriano, Juan, they begin the Willamette Valley Immigration Project. And their whole argument is ultimately like, we're going to organize undocumented people, right? But the first thing we have to do is build some trust. And so they would hold these meetings, right, of the Willamette Valley Immigration Project, and nobody would show up. No immigrants would show up. They're like, who are you guys, right? Like, second generation, third generation Mexican Americans, Chicanos, right, who had no real connection to the immigrant community in the Pacific Northwest. And so they started thinking about, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get people to trust us, right? What's the work that we're going to do? And so they would literally just go out in the community and start giving people their phone numbers and they started doing essentially paralegal work and saying, hey, if La Migra picks you up, call us, right? Call us. And so they started doing these little red cards. They call them Little Red Card Campaign. Well, what's interesting is that the first person that calls them is not somebody that had gotten a little red card, but somebody who had met one of the paralegals at a party and had written her number down on his arm. And so when he got caught by Migra, he's like, this lady's a lawyer, right? And so he calls her and is able to be released, right? She's able to get him out. And that really begins the flood of like, oh, hey, you could trust these people. Like, they help get me out. And like that one case, right, is what ultimately just opens up the floods, opens up the flood doors. And so the more they started to kind of do that work, the more they started to say, hey, we actually don't know that much, right, about the immigrants in this area. And so they started to do surveys, right? They started to go out and conduct surveys with immigrants and say, okay, where do you work? What do you do? How much are you paid? Da-da-da-da. And what they start to find is that there's this huge number of them that are working in reforestation, right? Which they had never heard or knew anything about right? That they're working in reforestation, they're replanting trees, right? And so again, during the 1980s, clear cutting, right, is a really big thing, right? They're cutting down forests left and right, but they're being replanted, right, by these Mexican immigrants. And so what they realized, right, is they start doing this plotting, right, and trying to figure out how tree planting works and how tree planting contracts work. And what they discover is that all of this is BLM land, right? The BLM land is being leased out to contractors to clear cut, but then the BLM is responsible for replanting it. And so it turns out that the number one employer of undocumented immigrants in the Pacific Northwest was the federal government. And so they start to focus on organizing piñeros, right, which is where piñeros y campesinos, right, is they start working with tree planters. And tree planting is some of the most dangerous work that you can imagine, right? It's dangerous, it's isolated, it's cold, it's, there's usually like, those of you who grew up around here or grew up in Western Washington or Western Oregon, like, there's roads, then there's logging roads, and then there's like the 10-mile hike that these guys are doing to get to the places that they have to replant, right? And so there were all these stories of people just going out into the mountains and never coming back, right? And there was a rumor that persisted that a whole crew was lost during the Mount St. Helens explosion that nobody ever found, right? And so they really start to focus their work on with the piñeros, right? But again, like, why do you trust, right? Why do you trust these folks? They're not immigrants. They're not, what do they offer you, right? Why would we join a union? And so they start to sort of go through, they start to implement this model, right, that is this kind of borrowed from the 1960s anti-Vietnam work, where people would have draft resistance clinics, right, where everybody would come in and people would fill out conscientious objector status and other ways to sort of avoid the draft, right? And so they took that model and they turned it into an immigration model, right? They said, okay, we're going to do these big clinics. Everybody show up. We'll do all the paperwork and we'll put this class together and I'll walk you through the process of naturalization. And this all happens, of course, because of 1986, because of the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which gave amnesty to undocumented immigrants. And at the same time, right, while Picun is doing this work, at the time they were called the Willamette Valley Immigration Project, while they're doing this work, there's a whole host of shady characters who are, taking people's money and not actually filing papers or filing papers incorrectly or whatever. And so at that time, that builds an incredible amount of trust for the WVIP in the immigrant community. Now, what happens is that they start building a union that then becomes primarily not farm workers, right? Because what happens when you get papers is you find other work, right? Construction work or cannery work or other places where you need papers. But they keep paying dues, right? So even though they're not members, they're not farm workers anymore, they're so sort of like grateful for the organization and what it's done for them and their quality of life that they keep paying dues, and they're essentially subsidizing, right, the organizing work that Picun is doing and bringing another generation through immigration, through naturalization processes, and bringing in that ultimately subsidize the work of another generation. And so it's like quite literally sort of passing it down, right? It's quite literally that model of organizing that helps Picun sustain its presence to this day, right? So I'm running out of time. So I'm just this is the first labor strike that they have. Caesar comes down and is in person very supportive, but again, doesn't decide to give any support from the UFW in terms of tangible support. This is Cipriano in the fields talking to workers. And this was a rent strike that happened during that first farm worker unionization drive, and they created this Campo Benito Juarez, where they were being charged like $14 or $15 a week to live in these shacks. And so they first started with a rent strike. They said, we're not paying you. And then eventually evolved into the first labor contract that was ever signed for Picun. Picun continues to do work in the fields, but also I think has become a multifaceted organization, right? They do a number of different works, not just unionization work, but they do, I think, a lot of community building, right? And so they created a kind of umbrella organization called Capaces that has various different organizations underneath it, like a Latino student organization, a parent organization, a Salem Kaiser Parent Coalition organization, and they're all kind of under the umbrella of a group they call Capaces. Picun is also a group that continues to change over time, right, and shows an incredible ability to adapt to its situation. And so as more and more indigenous people migrate from Mexico into the United States, there's a growing need for people who speak indigenous languages, right? And so instead of Picun continuing to do the kind of organizing work that it did in the past, it organizes around indigenous identity. It's hired indigenous speakers, indigenous organizers. They do a lot of hometown organizing. So if any of you are familiar with sort of the kind of social structure of indigenous communities, you have to go back to the hometown and talk to people there and get the leaders to buy in, that then tell other people like, okay, these people are good, you can organize. They have the radio station that transmits in Spanish, Zapotec and Triqui. They are an organization that continuously is dealing and adapting with what's changing, right? Early on in the early 1990s, the majority of the people who are working in the nursery industry, for instance, were indigenous women. It's like, okay, we have to hire indigenous women organizers, right? That's what we have to do. You can't have, for all intents and purposes, a white Mexican going into an indigenous community, speaking to indigenous women and expecting to get anywhere. And so they've shown this incredible ability to adapt. And I interviewed this governor one of the governor's aides in Oregon for the book, and he said to me, we don't do anything without thinking about how Picun's going to respond to it first, right? And I'm like, that's an incredible admission, right, of the kind of power that Picun has built. This is the Capaces Leadership Institute, and again, like the Capaces CLI, they just opened a new building next to their union building, their union hall, in which they offer all kinds of different classes. And so again, they do surveys. They have their fingers on the pulse. A lot of the indigenous women were saying, "Hey, we need to learn how to drive. Right? We are constrained, sometimes by our husbands. We don't get to go out and do the things we want to do. We don't get to." X, Y, and Z, and say, okay, well, we're going to have a driver education class for indigenous women. That's what we're going to do. And so that's what they did at Capaces Leadership Institute. They had, hey, our kids don't know, how to use these computers, and they want to learn how to do. So they bought a bunch of computers and started doing, from basic stuff like email to coding to all kinds of different things that they have there. So driver's license classes, coding. I mean, even things like some of the women wanted to do wreaths for Christmas as a fundraiser. Okay, well, let's do that. We'll bring somebody in and teach you how to do that, right? And so it's constantly responsive to what the community wants, as opposed to this kind of top-down model of what people think the community needs, right? And so, yeah, that's been a really impactful program, I think, for them. And in addition to that, they have people who have the children of farm workers who are on the school boards now, who are running for mayor, they continue to push for a police oversight board. That continues to be a struggle, right, in terms of police violence. And so it's become much more than a union, right? It's become much more than a union that's responsive to these community needs. And, when I started to sit down and write this book, I started thinking about this part of the book and saying, like, when I talked to Larry and the people, I was like, this is, for me, right, I think you can use this as like, hey, whenever somebody new comes on board, you just give them my book and they'll know the history and they'll know the ethos of the organization, and it'll serve like as a primer, right, for what you want who you want to be working for the organization. And they were super into that idea and super supportive. The last thing I want to say is, I had access to the Picun archives. They were in boxes, in no discernible order. And I had made the dumbest promise that has ever been made. And I said, hey, if you let me have access to the archives, I'll help you organize them. Don't ever do that. I am not a professional archivist. And it was very humbling to understand that I am not a professional archivist. But the good thing that came out of that, right, is that Larry and the other people at the PICUN realized how important it was for these archives to be public and not in their attic and not wasting away. And so they've been acquired by the University of Oregon. And there's still some stuff like immigration files and things that are private that are not going to be sent there. But I had always hoped that, and this is why I say that it gave me chills when Alexis said that, because I had always hoped that this would show other people, right, that you can write this book, right? It's not, and I never wanted to write an authoritative history of the Pacific Northwest, Mexicans in the Pacific Northwest. This is my story, right? This is a story that I told, and maybe, maybe not even correctly, right? But this is a story that I told, and I hope that it serves as inspiration for others to tell their stories, right? And I never want to serve as a gatekeeper. I never want to serve as an authority, right? I never want to serve those roles. I always want to, all I want to do is to not talk about the book like chapter by chapter and, give you my thesis, but to show you how it got put together, right? Because it's a whole lot less important what I got to say, and a whole lot more important for you to be able to put together a book, right? Put together your story. And so I highly encourage all of you, right, to think of your family members and of your community as an archive, right? As a place where there are tremendous stories of hope, of resistance, of joy, of all of those things in the face of 500 Mexicans worked here, 500 Mexicans worked there, 10,000 pounds of this or 10,000 pounds of that. So thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad to be back in the Pacific Northwest. And thank you all for coming in the face of what's still a pandemic. Thank you so much.
Good evening, and thank you again so much for that wonderful talk. Really appreciate it. So I'm told we have some time for discussion. I have a microphone that I will bring to you. If there's a comment or question you have for our speaker, then now is the time. So, yes. All right.
Why do you speak so much about PICUN? Why not the Washington State part of it? I grew up in Washington State, Toppenish, on the reservation, where there was a lot of Hispanics and farm workers. Why do you not speak of that part, only Oregon and PICUN? Yet AFL-CIO was very involved in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think PICUN, or the UFW, AFL-CIO, they have a very, I think, storied history in Washington. And I think what Alma and Frank are doing now, I think there's a really important farm worker story to be told in Washington. I told this Oregon story because of my access to the resources, right? My access to the archive. It's the people that I knew, it's the people that I trusted me. If I tried to come and do that in Washington, they don't know me, right? They don't have any reason to say, okay, yeah, Mario, we trust you, come and look at our stuff, right? Come and tell our story. I think that these kind of stories have to be organic, right? And they have to be treated with care by people who come from those communities, right? And so, we said we worked here, when we were younger, but, I didn't know people who had been here for a long time, and I didn't know, people who had been working in the fields for a long time or working as organizers for a long time. And so I don't in any way mean to diminish, right, the work that's been done in Washington and continues to be done in Washington. But I just feel like my job was to tell the story that I knew. And again, hopefully, inspire people to tell the story of Washington, the story of Idaho. And, the reason that it's the Pacific Northwest is because that's what authors want. I mean, that's what publishers want, right? That's what they wanted me to call it. And I was like, okay, but it's really a story about Oregon. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have another question or comment for our speaker? Someone has relieved me of my roving mic duties, so thank you for that. Is there anyone else?
First of all, thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation, and thank you for coming here. What's next for you? What are you working on now? Historians are always on to the next topic. Your curiosity, I'm sure, is running and your research is going. What is your next project, and where are you taking this now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I always wanted to tell a farm worker story. And I joke around that I turned into an environmental historian because I had to learn all this stuff about trees, right? And I didn't know anything about trees, never worked in trees. And so when I got to California, I'm at UC Merced, I'm in the Central Valley. I mean, it's the largest sort of agricultural economy in the world, right? And so I was like, okay, well, now I'm gonna do a book about farm workers in the Central Valley, and I'm gonna tell that story, and one that's not about Caesar and the UFW, but tell a different story. It turns out I need to learn a lot about water. Right, so I'm all about water right now. Right, I'm doing water rights, subsidence, drilling, water tables. I'm doing all of that, and so now I'm working on a book that I call "The Color of Water: Farm Workers' Rights and Water Justice in the Central Valley." And so I look at how sort of water rights have changed because there's a lot of stuff about like the politics of water rights. I'm more interested in sort of how it affects people on the ground. And so I'm looking at an area called the Westlands Water District. I'm looking at a number of different farm worker organizations that existed in that area. So I'm continuing to do farm worker history, unwittingly also doing water, environmental history. So I've become an environmental historian when I thought I was a labor historian. So I would like at some point to, I think, revisit the Pacific Northwest. But I think part of it is also, when you become tenured, you start getting all these other stuff, administrative duties and all the things that you do. And so I was like, okay, I'm in the Valley. I want to write about the Valley. But I think eventually I'd like to come back and write more about the Northwest.
Okay, get back there. All the way in the back, I see Micah. There you go, sir. All right.
So, as a history major, I'm trying to do a project on Chief Joseph, and I'm hoping to get access to the reservation through Coville. And if I can get to do some oral histories, what advice would you give me?
That's a really good question as well. So here's what I'll say, right? First and foremost, before any sort of technical advice that I would offer, I would tell you this. Be prepared to leave something for them, right? There's way too much work, I think, that's done that is strictly extractive, that you're just taking something from the community and using it for yourself, right? And so using it for this book or using it for this project. And so whenever you're going to be doing work in communities, especially communities that are not your own, you need to have a serious conversation about what you can bring to them, right? And so what kind of resources, what kind of, and so that's what I ended with the book, is sort of like I told Larry and Pekun, I was like, this is what I'm going to leave to you, right? I'm going to leave this as a type of manual, right, for future organizers who you want to work for the organization. I'm also going to help take care of the archives so that we don't lose the archives. I made a dumb promise, but I eventually got it to the right spot, right? And when I talked to, one of the things also that happened with the Bracero Project is that we would record the interviews, and then we gave all of them copies of the interviews, right? And so you get to have a piece of your family out of this as well, right? That's going to live forever, and hopefully in generations and generations to come, you'll be able to hear the voice of your great-great-great-grandfather talking about their experience. And it almost without fail, the children of the Braceros would say, "Oh, I had no idea. I had no idea," right? And so when you're working with indigenous people, that might be, it's going to be different than that, right? But you need to figure out, first and foremost, what can you give to them? It's not just about taking something from a community. You have to give something back. There's way too much research that people never see, right? If you're writing like a book, for instance, that book was originally 300 some odd pages in dissertation form that referenced all these other authors and these theories and this and that. And I told the publisher when I was shopping the book for publishers, I said, look, it's a 300-page book. I want it to be a 150-page book, 180-page book, because if I write a 300-page book that says, as so-and-so argues and blah, 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 nobody's going to read that. Like, none of the people that I write about are going to read that. And so it becomes important that whatever you produce, it needs to be legible to the people who you're talking about, right? And so, for instance, we're in the process now of turning that into a graphic novel, right? And so that's the kind of stuff where you're like, okay, you've got to be thinking about, and I'm not going to take credit for the idea. My grad student is doing that with his dissertation, and I'm like, I'm going to pay you to also do that with my book, right? And so that becomes a generational thing too. Like, I wouldn't have thought of that, right? And he's like, I'm like, let's do that. So that's I know that's not necessarily the answer you're looking for, but that's the first thing. The oral history stuff, the actual nitty-gritty of doing interviews, one is like, come prepared, come knowing what you're talking about. The more that you do research on whoever you're interviewing, the more they're going to give you, right? Because if you go into an interview and you're doing like an intake interview, like, oh, where were you born? What did you do? Da, da, da. That's all you're going to get, right? But if you say, hey, I know you were working in, cherries and this time, this year, tell me, tell me about how you pick cherries, or tell me about what the process is like. Like, you need to have you need to do your homework, right? The more homework you do, the better answers you're going to get. And the deeper you can get in the conversation. Bring visual aids also, like if you have pictures or things like that, like especially if you're interviewing older folks, like when I interviewed older people, I would bring photos or maps or things like that when you put that in front of them, it jogs their memory in a way that like you asking questions doesn't, right? And so visual aids is always really, really helpful. I would bring an image of like railroad workers or whatever, and people would be like, oh yeah, I know where that is, and I would get a lot more information that way. And then, what was the other thing I was going to say? So be prepared. Follow-up interviews, like 2 or 3, 4 interviews with the same person is going to be way, way more fruitful than trying to interview 10 people one time, right? And then you'll eventually, if you keep doing that kind of work, you'll eventually strike gold, right? Eventually you'll find somebody who's like, man, you need to talk to Doña or Don, you need to talk to Fulanito or whatever, and like that's gonna, there'll be a gatekeeper in that community, I guarantee it. And if you find that gatekeeper, eventually they'll spill the beans, so to speak, right? You'll get to talk to a bunch of different kinds of people. On a technical note, bring extra batteries, make sure your stuff's on, right?
You mentioned that you were working with the Smithsonian on those pictures of the people. Were you able to find a lot of those people, that specifically those pictures, and add that to that particular display?
We were able to find a ton of people. We ended up doing 600 interviews overall. And then we ended up running out of money, but we did towards the end, we actually went to Mexico and started doing interviews there as well with a lot of these sending communities. Because what you'd find is that the same communities over and over again would be the ones that were sending people. And so, yeah, we ended up doing 600 interviews on our own. We turned that into a traveling exhibit that is now closed, but probably traveled around the country, booked straight for 5 years, right? And everywhere that it would go. So the other cool thing that we did with the website is that we made it an open source, and we uploaded videos on how to conduct your own oral histories, and then how to upload them into our website and enter the metadata into our website. And so it grew from 600 to we're probably close to 1,000 now, right? And you can still do it. So even if you have relatives that are brasileiros that are not in the archive, you can go and do oral histories with them and upload it to the archive, right? And so what we would do is, wherever so there was a team of 10 or 15 of us, and wherever that exhibit would go to a new town, like, it would go to like Oregon, University of Oregon, I would go up and do a talk and talk about the project and encourage people to do the work. And then we'd see like a little uptick in the videos, in the oral histories. And so, yeah, we were able to identify a ton of them. We were able to identify locations. We were able to use braceros to tell us where the photos were taken. We were able to glean a lot of information. And then we were ultimately were able to put together an exhibit that we were proud of, right? And an exhibit that showed the humanity of the people that we're talking about, for sure.
Are there other questions? I guess we have time for a couple more. Yes. Microphone's coming.
First, I would like to thank you for being here tonight. It's very enlightening, everything you're saying about, the history of the Pacific Northwest immigrants that, were working there. My question has to do more with now. We have new stories in the making. Now we have legalized immigrants that are coming into the States to work. I know in Washington, I don't know other states. What do you think about that? I mean, we have all these population that are illegal immigrants who are working our fields, and now we have these thousands of workers coming, and to me, they're kind of competing with our workers who live here, and they don't have the same benefits.
So
do you know anything about that?
Are you talking about like the new like H-2A and stuff, like the new guest worker programs?
Yes.
Yeah. So my sense is that as a policy position, guest worker programs are terrible, right? I think there's no protections, and no matter how many protections are written into the law, because the original Bracero program had a number of protections written into the law that were, they couldn't be segregated, they couldn't, they had to be paid a prevailing wage, they were supposed to be provided with housing and meals, and there's one thing that the letter of the law says, and then what actually happens in reality, right? And in reality, guest worker programs are always exploitative, right? And they're always extractive, and they're always, they always constrict freedom, right? Freedom of movement, freedom of employer, freedom of all those things, right? And so, as a practice, right, I would say, policy position, guest worker programs never work in their intended effort to protect immigrants, protect workers. They always work in terms of bringing in workers and lowering wages and providing growers with windfalls, but they don't work for immigrants in any way, or workers in any way. On the other hand, right, if people are here, organize them, right? That's the answer. Like, the people who come here to work are not the enemy, right? The growers are the enemy. The exploiters are the enemy. So, yeah, there are people here who have been here, who've been here for a long time, who are invested in the community, right? Who are workers, but all those workers are also invested in their community. They just can't stay. You know what I mean? And so, as a matter of strategy, organize workers, no matter what their immigration status is.
Thank you.
All right, let's take another one over here. Yes.
I just wanted to say that in the beginning when you talked about, because you're from Oregon, and you were like, why Oregon? Well, this Christmas I was with my family, and I had already did a little bit of asking my family, because my dad is from Michoacan and my abuelita, and so I wanted to know the story, right? So I'm from Medford, and I was like, I asked my tia and my abuelita, I was like, why Oregon? Why here? And I got to hear the whole story, and it's almost like, I keep telling my dad he needs to write a book about his life. But you have inspired me to pursue possibly getting that down on paper, at least for my own family, because I had the same question and I got a really, really awesome story from it. So thank you.
Let me add to that too, that you say, oh, well, just write it down for my own story, and I think that's great. But it's also like, storytellers come in many forms, right? And so you don't have to write a book, right? Like, you could paint, you can draw, I mean, there's a myriad of ways of producing stories, right? And so this was my way, right? And so, like, do whatever you want, just do it, you know what I mean? Whatever it is, however you want to tell that story, just make sure it gets told.
Yeah, it's awesome. I was like, wow, I had the same question.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, there's a hand in the back. I'm closer.
Thank you. So I'm also from Grants Pass, really close to Medford. And when you mentioned Medford and being surprised that someone would let them like switch the flags,
Yeah.
it kind of reminded me, like, I've heard some things in classes and just on my own reading about like Southern Oregon, and it seems, at least from what I've read, that it's like got a particularly problematic history.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, which it seems like it, but I'm curious if you would agree with that as well. But if so, like, I'm curious about ways that I could learn more about that, because when I look up things, sometimes it's hard to like find what I'm looking for, and I have familial history there as well. Like, one of my relatives was the mayor of Grants Pass at one point. I just want to know, like, maybe good things, bad things, but just find that kind of thing out. And so I don't know where to look for that.
I highly encourage you to go to local libraries and local archives, right? And so one of the things with like the digitization of records and then being able to look things up online is that that by definition essentially eliminates a whole host of archival sources, right? And so small libraries, especially, like, one of the main sources of archival work that I did was I would go to Medford and I'd go to Ontario and I'd go to different places and I'd say, hey, well, how far back do your newspapers go? I'm like, okay, and can I get your newspapers from 1942 to this? And I started looking through, and literally in some of them, they're like notebooks that are like cut out, right? Like, they're literally like glued on to like cardboard or whatever, paper, particle board or whatever. And so, like, there I would find these, and that's where I found that photo of the Mexican flag, was in not online, not in an archive, not, you know what I mean, in a literal kind of like how like old photo albums, like in an old photo album, but like newspaper cutouts, right? And so that kind of history is like, especially with the kind of defunding of libraries, right, and public libraries and county libraries, that stuff is just getting tossed. Like people are literally throwing that stuff out, right? And so it becomes one of these things where a lot of those libraries don't have money for digitization projects. There's not a whole lot of like NEA grants or NEH grants that are going to give, a small town library money to digitize their newspapers. And so to me, that proved invaluable, right, to find a lot of these stories. I didn't share it, but I found an article of my great uncle dying, being killed in a farming accident. And I went back to my dad and I was like, because I have an uncle Remy, right, and Remigio. And there was an article about my uncle, about Remigio Sifuentez being killed in a farming accident. And I went back and I was like, who is this, right? Who is Remigio Sifuentez? This is way too old for being my uncle Remy, right, my tío Remy. And he's like, oh yeah, that was your grandfather's nephew, right? And I was like, I have no idea who this person is, right? And so that was one of those things where I like, actually your mom's the one that told me the story, right? So my tia Lupe is the one that's like, oh yeah, she's the one that was able to tell me what happened to her Uncle Remy. And so those local newspapers, the good, bad, or indifferent, right? That's where you'll find the stuff, right? You'll find, and man, like librarians are like angels on planet Earth. They're the greatest people in the world, right? And they want nothing more than for you to be as excited about nerdy stuff as they are. Nothing more. And so, yeah, go to the library, man. Go when you go home, go to the county library, look at all that stuff. If there's a particular period you're interested in, be like, hey, how far back do your newspapers go is a good question. Yep.
Anyone else? If not, then we'll just take this time to thank our speaker once again. Thank you so much. A nice warm round of applause. And we really appreciate the
Thank you so much. I love
the
coming
talk,
back here.
and thank you all for coming out. You have a good evening.